A social science perspective helps us to reimagine, ideally, to reimagine an institutional or collective response that avoids protectionism and reductionism. So in keeping my focus on the institutional and structural aspects of clericalism and clergy misconduct, I want to turn to a typology of responses to abuse and misconduct, especially with respect to engineering and controlling the narrative after the fact. I believe a social science approach can here provide some insight into the church's reductionist and scapegoating tendencies that obfuscate the culpability and do a disservice to survivors. Start this section with another vignette. Sarah is a bright and motivated 26-year-old single woman aspiring to be a nurse. She's also drawn to social work and theology, and is very excited when through mutual acquaintances she meets Daniel, a well-respected theology professor and pastor. Daniel is 39 years old and married with several children. The two of them hit it off and begin text exchanges about theology. Though both acknowledge that they are drawn to one another, they are clear that they could not justify a romantic relationship. However, Daniel repeatedly breaks his promise to stop sending text exchanges and to, quote, set her free for another relationship. He obsesses over her and communicates his fantasy of her visiting him wearing her nurse's uniform. Daniel eventually invites Sarah to be his executive assistant. Sarah puts her medical studies on hold and becomes completely financially dependent on her work for him. She contributes significantly to Daniel's writings, but is never given co-authorship. Daniel begins to form theological justifications for his, quote, less than ideal situation. He tells her that both she and his wife were, quote, ordained to him by God, and his love for Sarah can simply not be the devil's work. Daniel defiantly maintains a romantic relationship with her despite the objections of his friends, his mother, and his wife, who ultimately plunges into deep depression and self-blame. Though Sarah tells Daniel, we simply can't justify what we're doing, she affirms her trust in him, dependence on him, and her willingness to submit to his decision about the path forward for all of them. Acknowledging that no real-life situation falls neatly into a typology, multiple scenarios can be playing out simultaneously, I want to look at these reaction types in this grid. So first, in the upper left-hand corner of the grid, one reaction type is to protect the institution and the offender. Reality can be whitewashed, attributing behavior to tough circumstance, abusive behavior to tough circumstances, to different contexts, especially if abuse occurred years ago. It was way back then. We acknowledge that everyone messes up, we're all sinners, and celebrate the redemption story for the abuser. Second, in the bottom left-hand corner, we can protect the institution, but use the offender as the scapegoat. We can cancel the offender, declaring them a bad apple, removing them and forgetting about them, making it not our problem. We're going to protect the institution. We had nothing to do with it. Third, the upper right-hand corner, to protect the offender, but not the institution. This is the RVO and DARVO, right? Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. The reversing victim and offender basically says she was the problem and the institution scapegoated him. He was the victim of the woke mob who performed a hit job, things of that sort. And then the fourth possibility, it's a lot more time consuming. It doesn't include scapegoating, and it acknowledges the culpability of the institution and the leader. Doing so requires transparency, truth-telling, seeing the offender and the survivor in context, and acknowledges that an offender can have brilliance, charisma, good works, great ideas, along with deficient character and a toxicity that breeds destruction. With this typology in mind, I want to reread the story from a moment ago, but I'm going to replace the pseudonyms with their actual identities. This is actually the story of one of the most venerated theologians in the 20th century, Karl Barth and Charlotte von Kirschbaum. So let me reread that with that knowledge. So it's not Sarah and Daniel, it's Charlotte and Karl. Charlotte von Kirschbaum was a bright and motivated 26-year-old single woman aspiring to be a nurse. She was also drawn to social work and theology and was very excited when, through mutual acquaintances, she met Karl Barth, a well-respected theology professor and pastor. Barth was 39 years old at the time and married with several children. The two of them hit it off and began text exchanges. They were writing letters to one another. Though both acknowledged that they were drawn to one another, they were clear that they couldn't justify a romantic relationship. However, Karl repeatedly broke his promise to stop sending her letters and to set her free for another man. He obsessed over her, communicated his fantasy of her visiting him wearing her nurse's uniform. He eventually invited Charlotte to be his secretary. Charlotte put her medical studies on hold and became completely financially dependent on her work for Karl Barth. She contributed significantly to his writings, but was never given co-authorship. Karl Barth began to form theological justifications for his, quote, less than ideal situation. He told them that both he and his wife were ordained to him by God, and his love for Charlotte simply couldn't be the devil's work. Karl Barth defiantly maintained a romantic relationship with Charlotte for their whole lives, despite the objections of his friends, his mother, and his wife, Nellie. His wife was Nellie. Nellie ultimately plunged into deep depression and self-blame. Even though Charlotte told Karl at some point, we can't justify our way. She affirmed her trust in him, dependence on him, and her willingness to submit to him. And I just want to let that marinate for a moment, along with the knowledge that the actions of the venerated Barth have been called immoral by some, especially since the more letters came out showing more about their relationship, I think within the last 10 or 20 years. So people have called it immoral, but to my knowledge, it's never been defined as abusive. But also importantly, Barth's actions have been used by abusers to rationalize and justify their abusive behavior. And his theological rationalization has been used by abusers to do that.